Okay, if you can see that screen, give me a wave or something and then we'll get started. Oh, good. Okay, well, welcome to our fourth presentation. France, Liberty at Home, Imperialism Abroad. And today we'll be talking about the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, what's known as the period of the Third Republic. And you'll see those are some of the topics that I list on there. La Belle Époque, we'll translate that when we get there. And this drive to a secular society, and then World War I. Last week, we talked about the Paris Commune. And I talked a good bit about the Paris Commune because it's such a figure especially in leftist ideology, that when the great people's breakthrough, it wasn't so popular at the time, but it still arouses passions. And then at the time of the Commune, we have the creation of what's called the Third Republic. And it's also a period of poor public health in France. This is a picture of the Paris Commune in the streets that we saw that. This is more likely peasant dress, not this glorified stuff. It was a tough time for living in the countryside where you have one, that may be one suit of clothes or maybe there's one other. It's a tough time. And then we had this scramble for Africa in imperialism. So by 1913, Africa is divided up. So what's blue are the French colonies. So it's most of West Africa, and then Madagascar down here, a little bit of equatorial Africa. And just for your information, the pink is British. So the British have a good deal of East Africa, starting up here, Egypt, Sudan, what's now Tanzania, South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, which were called Northern and Southern Rhodesia later, and then other imperial countries. So Africa is really the target of European powers. This purple thing is the Belgian Congo, which is infamous for what happened there. And just for your green is Portuguese colonies. Mozambique and Angola. I wanted to point out, I have it at times pointed out books. This Theodor Zeldin, this is actually 2 volumes. One's called Intellect and Pride, the other is called Politics and Anger. They may be among the best history books I've ever read. Now, they require a certain familiarity with French history. But if you get to that point, it's just an incredible discussion of what went on in France. So here we are at the Third Republic, which is 1871 when the Paris Commune is defeated and the French have lost the war to the Germans, to the Prussians, to 1940, which is the time of the Nazi invasion. First of all, French were required to pay a huge amount of money to the Germans. And the Germans kept an army there for a while until it was paid off. And to everyone's surprise, they paid it off really fast. The recovery of Alsace-Lorraine became a point that the French never stopped talking about in this entire period. They had recovered it from the Germans. And if you remember, I don't know if you know, at the time of the Second World War, they lost it again. In 1945, they got it back. Here is the image that the French have of German police in Alsace with that helmet with the point of the Pickelhaube, as it's called, that helmet with the point on top. French were very unhappy with this. In the classrooms, It's the black stain. Children are taught that France must get Alsace-Lorraine back. Oops, we'll get to that. Third Republic has a very active cultural life. These are artists whom you presumably whose names you're familiar with, like Cézanne, Monet, Matisse, Rodin. In literature, Marcel Proust gave you this image of what's translated as remembrance of things past, à la recherche du temps perdu, a mere 7 volumes. You can read it between now and next week. But it's considered one of the great pieces of literature, actually of the 20th century. He wrote it in it's published in the 1920s. But we get other artists like Rimbaud, the poet, Debussy as a composer, Emile Durkheim as a founder of kind of sociology. This is really, on the intellectual side, a very exciting time. And it's also a time of colonial expansion. That map we just saw of West Africa, it also includes North Africa. Remember, we talked about Algeria. We talked about Morocco. I should say that someone mentioned to me this morning that when I talked about Morocco, I should have talked about the Berbers. Well, I can only say that the Berbers are important, but I just can't cover everything in what we're doing. Berbers are another tribal group in Morocco. So among my choices, for example, I spent some time when we talked about Egypt to talk about Egyptian cotton, just to say that I don't want to talk just about wars and emperors and presidents and so on. So I thought that was, to me, very interesting about how Egyptian cotton was so important and so valuable for a long time. And the expansion went on in Indochina. We've seen some of that, and of course, we'll talk about all these things. There was the Third Republic at the time of 1871. It isn't as though everybody shook hands and was happy, and we will go forth for the glory of France. It just wasn't true. You have a strong monarchist movement that talks about the reestablishment of the monarchy versus the Republicans. And it's interesting when you look at the elections of 1871, if you look at the last two there, the monarchist House of Orléans and the traditional monarchists, they have by far a majority of people in the National Assembly. And just to show some others where this radical Republicans, radicals are not radicals in a 20th century sense, but in that time, that's the name they got. The point is that the monarchists themselves were internally divided, couldn't get together. The House of Orléans refers to the monarchy after 1830, and the traditional monarchists referred to the House of Louis XIV and Louis XVI, and the 18th, actually. And one of the things that Zeldin points out in those books that I mentioned is that he's trying to figure out what makes areas of France interested in the monarchy. I mean, what's the point? And what he gives a lot of, he summarizes lots of explanations, but the crucial point is that the monarchists are those people who wanted local control, that is, elites who wanted local control, as opposed to more centralized power from Paris. So, they may have said they wanted a king, but they'd be happy to have a king living somewhere else. So it gives, again, Brittany, one of the places that we often mention as against Paris. They have lots of support for monarchists, but it doesn't mean that they're real happy with the king. They just wanted to have their own, the elites locally wanted to have their own control. So here's an example of the problems. In the 1880s, this man named General Boulanger, who everyone thought might turn out to be the answer to this republic, which they didn't want. Here's these banquets. Banquet in honor of General Boulanger. And this is his image. He got support, interesting, in different places. In the working class districts of Paris, which were upset over this rule by what they saw as middle classes, traditionalist Catholics and loyalists. They wanted the old style government back. Well, Boulanger turned out to be a flash in the pan. Actually, he ran off to Belgium and later committed suicide. But it was a real fear that there'd be a coup in the 1880s. Now, here he is. General Revanche, as they call it, General Revenge. One of the things he talked about was vengeance for defeat in that war of 1870. But the state is marked by this church versus state. The church versus the army, the elites. These are the people who were upset with this growing national centralization. And as you recall, last week I mentioned things like the instability of the government. Of the first 6 presidents, 4 resigned, 1 died in office, and 1 was assassinated. But by 1900, things were a little more stable. But still, you have the left versus the right in this whole pre-World War I period. Now, I've mentioned these Ferry laws in 1882, maybe because I think that what happens in the schools is so important for the development of the nation. These are the laws that said, get the church out of the schools. We want lay teachers. And of course, when you pass a law, things don't happen overnight. And you have a continuing struggle. There's often the image of the local instituteur, the elementary school teacher, versus the local priest. That appears in lots of literature. That's the image. The army becomes an independent power center, another sign of a government that's not so stable. And we see it today in various countries. And we'll see in a minute this Dreyfus affair, where a man named Alfred Dreyfus, whose family fled from Alsace after 1870. They want to be French, they don't want to be German. And Dreyfus becomes an officer on the general staff. In 1894, someone found a document in the embassy that suggested that there was a German spy. And the finger was pointed immediately at Alfred Dreyfus. Here's a picture where his sword is broken ceremonially. Here's Alfred Dreyfus himself. He's convicted of treason. Now, what's interesting here is that lots of the charges are that he's Jewish. He's a Jew, and it unleashes a certain anti-Semitic sentiment. But it's interesting, the Dreyfus affair could never have happened in Germany because no Jew ever would have been promoted to the general staff. So you have certain things changing within France. In 2 years, he's convicted and sent off to Devil's Island off the coast of South America, pretty barren place. In 1896, new evidence comes up, found out by Dreyfus's brother. The evidence was that the document that convicted him was a forgery. This evidence is suppressed by military court. Now, is this anti-Semitism? Yes, but it's more than that in the sense that the French army doesn't want to admit any mistakes. You may be familiar with other military traditions like that. And in 1898, Émile Zola, the writer, publishes this famous piece in a newspaper. Zola did run a newspaper at the time. J'accuse, I accuse the president of the republic. I accuse other people of suppressing evidence and carrying out a miscarriage of justice. And it becomes a cause célèbre in France. The Dreyfus affair becomes the talk of all the drawing rooms. Finally, in 1899, there's a new trial, and he's convicted again. The army doesn't want to hear this new evidence, but what happens first, he's convicted and then he's pardoned. So it's a half victory, and it wasn't until 1906 that he was actually exonerated. Whenever you read about Dreyfus, you find that he himself is not a hero. He's a modest man who was interested in serving the army and being a French patriot. And he wasn't a real articulate speaker, a very unlikely hero. But the Dreyfus affair really dominates urban conversation. Countryside doesn't care in the least. You know, they're interested in poverty or in the harvest or in something like that. But if, for example, if you go back and you read Proust, Remembrance of Things Past, you see how in polite society we're split down the middle between the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards, where people argue and suddenly stop talking to each other. Think about in our own society where all of a sudden, if you're pro-Trump, you find it difficult to have conversations with people who are anti-Trump. It's no longer just a disagreement about politics. It's a disagreement about society. Who should be in charge in society? Here's this quote: "Without L'Aurore," that's the newspaper where Zola published I Accuse, Dreyfus would have perhaps been left in prison, and as no one would have cared. And then here's this other comment: "Without Drummond and the Libre Parole," but he had been sent there. Well, Edouard Drummond was a spokesman for anti-Semitism, and he's the one who drummed up this campaign against Dreyfus. So, this is fought out in the newspapers, and Dreyfus is seen as a symbol of Jews in French society, and French society being dominated by this upstart bourgeoisie. And the people who support the army, no matter what the army does, are really upset. So this is called the affair, l'affaire in France. And who are the parties? In the larger provincial towns and in Protestant communities, you do have lots of Dreyfusards, as they're called. The small towns don't give a damn. It's not really any of their concern. But here you have the kind of newspaper fight. On the left, Dreyfus, a traitor. Vive la France, long live France. And at the bottom, Vive l'armée, long live the army. And on the bottom right, Abat les traîtres, down with the traitors. And on the other side, Dreyfus is innocent. And you have various kinds of defenders using some of the same vocabulary. Long live France, long live the Republic, long live the army, down with the traitors. But Dreyfus is, seen as a symbol for their desires. And it's interesting that the idea lives on. So in 1945, Charles Maurras, who was and we'll see him again for his right-wing activity, and he's convicted for collaborating with the Germans, his comment, "It's Dreyfus's revenge." That is, here in 1945, almost 50 years later, this idea is still alive among some people in the right wing. So what's the follow-up of the Dreyfus affair? First, parts of the church were very much involved. It's just interesting. The Assumptionist teaching order which had been a really charitable order. But then they turn here's from their newspaper. Each week, the Jews who exploit tax law in this sorry task seize the goods of the defenseless people. In the name of their sect, the bread of the poor is stolen. Here and there, wretched people agree to buy buildings at knockdown prices under the secret instruction of the Jewish conspiracy. Well, it's true. There are people who use tax law to seize the goods of defenseless people. The poor are, in many cases, oppressed. People buy buildings at knockdown prices. But then you associate that with a relatively small Jewish community when there are all kinds of people doing these things. One of the people who got caught up in this was Ferdinand de Lesseps, who was famous as the builder of the Suez Canal in the 1860s. Well, in the 1890s, he gets caught up in these campaigns to suck money out of ignorant investors. And this is at the same time, and here's his image, what's called La Belle Époque, the beautiful period. That is, in grand society, people are really enjoying themselves. Oh, I forgot to mention that in addition to the religious congregations that are really kicked out of teaching, remember I said there were the laws of 1892, but they were still hanging around. They got them out. And in 1905, you have a formal separation of church and state, which is secularism, which is still a big idea in France. But at that time, the Pope is very much upset over what's going on in France. And you get this, the right wing, actually the right wing has two parts. You have defense of the church by the traditional elites, and you have extra parliamentary forces, the Action Française, that's this led by this man, Charles Maurras, which I mentioned just a minute ago, the one who said it's Dreyfus's revenge. And here you have Action Française, which is founded in the late 1890s. And this newspaper, they say, they are the first of the French newspapers to free itself of the CGT. The CGT is this large-scale trade union, which they say is helped by international finance, which is a code word for Jews, because Jews are seen as a secret behind it. And then the bottom says, L'Action Française reappearing in its normal format. So this becomes part of the right-wing scene in France, and it continues to the Second World War. Meanwhile, Catholic voters are sort of disenchanted not just because of the Dreyfus affair, but its signs. But you also get anger from the left. And here's this famous novel by Émile Zola called Germinal, you can read it in English, about coal miners. And this man comes to town and he tries to organize the miners into a union against the predatory predatory owners. There's also a movie of it, which you can rent even on YouTube. No surprise, one of the leading characters is Gérard Depardieu, who's in every French film. But it's very graphic, that film. So this is a period not different from other industrializing countries. We certainly see it in Britain, we see it in the United States, see it in Germany. Peasant misery and an urban underclass. A lot of people are making money at the top, but there is a really difficult time for this urbanizing working class. So the CGT, which I just mentioned, is a national trade union, founded in 1895. It still exists, by the way. It stands for the General Confederation of Labor, CGT. until 1919, it was dominated by anarcho-syndicalist tendencies. That is, people who don't want any government, who don't want any political party, saying the people can rule. It's not the same thing as the Socialist Party, which we'll see in a minute. At the same time, you get the rise of a journalist by the name of Georges Clemenceau. He's the leader of the French radicals. And radicals is a funny word to describe a moderate middle class party, but that's what they call themselves. Here's Clemenceau. He published Zola's J'accuse, but he becomes increasingly politically moderate. When he became head of government in 1909, he represses a strike using the army. A lot of anger at him. And then in 1909, he got kicked out of the government. In 1917, he finally got back into the army, into the government, and we will see that the army was really declining in the First World War, and he's seen as a terrific organizer and an inspiration. Should also mention that in France, women are in a very subordinate position. They have almost no legal rights, and France accords such rights to women only much later than other industrial countries. They don't get the vote till 1945. They can't have a separate control. Married women can't have separate control of their goods until 1969. It's interesting that just a few weeks ago, we have a woman named as French prime minister. The second woman to do so, the first one only lasted a few weeks. But so we'll see about whether this changes anything. Going back to this term, la belle époque, la fin du siècle, these are terms that are used to describe this glorious life of the emerging bourgeoisie. And I think these images may be familiar to some of you. This is what we often see when they want to describe Paris in the late 19th, early 20th century. Elegant ladies. On the bottom right, you see dancing outdoors. And people, depending on who you are, this period of romanticism is also called a period of decadence. And you get an erosion of a moral consensus. Here's another book if you're interested, and very interested in the illustration of the cover, France fin du siècle. It's in English. So what was decadence? And here are some of the things that's interesting, the charges. The society is marked by neurosis, it's claimed. The society is marked by neurosis, hysteria, hypnotism, morphinomania, that's drugs, scientific skullduggery, that is phony science. France leads the world, we think, in the number of alcoholics. Smoking becomes popular. I think the switch from cigars to cigarettes occurs after the mid-1880s. But women are not supposed to smoke, at least not in public. So you get the men going off by themselves. I found this little cartoon sort of amusing, where they're talking about Parisian styles, where they say, "Isn't that woman ridiculous with her enormous bust?" And then the response, "Well, that seems to be the style out in the sticks, en province, in the provinces, out in the sticks," is how I translate that. So, it's this snobism of Paris. And again, la belle époque. Well, in politics, we have the fear of the commune and the fear of a democratizing society. and a decline of the power of the church. The church had been an independent power center. It is declining, but it allies itself with other right-wingers. The Army Officer Corps closes its ranks. That's what to me, what the Dreyfus Affair is about. Of course, anti-Semitism is involved, but there's more than that. The Army Officer Corps sees itself as an elite. No one should question whatever it is they do. And you get the rise of right-wing nationalism. I mentioned Charles Maurras and the Action Française. And here we've been talking about this course, liberty, equality, fraternity. Well, what he's saying, Maurras, it's a campaign against him. This is Maurras right here leading this demonstration. I think you can see my cursor circling this guy with the trim beard. And there's a parade on the National Day of Joan of Arc, the kind of hearkening back to the French heroes. And Action Française, that's their newspaper and their movement, against on the bottom, against the home of the traitor Dreyfus. They're not letting this thing go. And in the late 19th century, they're all for imperialism. But that's the thing about this scramble for Africa. It's not just the right wing, it's everybody, including the so-called radicals and liberals. They really like the idea of expanding the French Empire. And we'll get to the empire in just a second. In 1905, we have this law on what's called laïcité, secularism. You know, Roman Catholicism in France had been established with what's called a concordat. Concordat is a government agreement with the papacy. And under Napoleon, they set up this concordat. And at the time of the Third Republic, they did away with that. They do away with this independent power center of the Roman Catholics in France. What's interesting is that Alsace-Lorraine was not in France at the time. So to 2022, this old concordat is still in effect in Alsace-Lorraine. It has a certain power of the church. But for other denominations, not just Christian, but Muslim and Jewish, the government has a certain control over when leaders are appointed. But in the 1870s, church recognizes loss of their property, but the clergy in many ways are independent, and despite the fact that the church loses power, they still get state subsidies. And that concordat of 1801 is still in effect in Alsace. And here is just a wall painting, laïcité, secularism in France. We've mentioned several times these laws on schools that get the church out of the schools. And I just thought I'd tell you, what does this mean, these laws? So what do you have in primary education? They talk about moral and civic education, which means nationalism in a sense, reading and writing. Okay. Remember, the prior schools were emphasizing church belief. But now we have language and elements of French literature. We have geography, especially France, history, especially France. They say their basic laws, lessons on law and political economy, natural sciences and mathematics, and how these apply to various trades like agriculture, hygiene, industrial arts, elements of drawing, gymnastics. Boys have military exercises, girls have needlework. Well, of course, like a lot of curricula, they lay down what should be there, and it's not always carried out. But anyway, this is what are the goals, what the new education is supposed to present. And I think you can probably apply this even now. not completely, to French schools. There's that law on the separation of the church and state, not just in schools. And just to bring it up to the modern day, there is an issue here. What does secularism mean about Muslims and Islam in France today, where Muslims now constitute 5% of the total population? There's a lot of Islamophobia in France, despite the fact that the state is supposed to be neutral. So laïcité, secularism. It started as a tool to protect the population to protect religious freedom, but not controlled by the state. But so here's a modern thing from a presentation where they say, actually, it's a way to protect religious freedom, freedom to believe or not to believe. That's the notion today, what some people say secularism is. However, in 2004, you get this law banning conspicuous religious symbols in the school. So crosses, headscarf, turbans, Jewish skull caps. None of this was an issue before Muslims became a topic in France. So what's happened is that secularism is now in some ways seen as an attack on religion rather than as a way to protect religious freedom. It's an ongoing issue. And we're jumping ahead from the Third Republic, but I want to point out how these themes that have appeared in French history continue to appear. I'm going to switch over here to the French socialists. And just to talk about who the left, when we was talking about the right wing with the army and the Action Française and the elites. On the left, by the way, left and right are words that are invented by the French from 1789. How you depended where you sat in the new assembly. So on the left, we have the party, it's called the SFIO. It stands for, you see here, Section Française de l'Internationale Ouvrière, where they're not even saying that this is strictly French. It's the French section of the Workers' International. It's an interesting contrast to Germany, where Germany is often seen as the strongest socialist party in Europe. Their party is called the Social Democrats of Germany. They're not talking about a section of the Workers' International. But here's what they call it in France, the SFIO. And French socialism goes back to the middle of the 19th century, a guy named Jules Guesde, who was interested in politics. We think of socialism as a combination of politics and social action, social welfare. Guesde wasn't that interested. And you have this, later on, this development of, are you a Marxist party? That is the proletarian revolution, or a reformist party that says we're going to just change the way state laws favor certain groups. And what they call in France the possibilists versus the impossibilists. That is the impossibilists who said, we're going to restructure society or nothing. The possibilists said, well, let's have gradual change and get things to help us. And the trade unions become, not the CGT that I mentioned, but other trade unions become involved in looking for gradual change. And we get the grand figure of French socialism, a man named Jean Jaurès. Here he is. It's a famous orator. And the French writer Romain Rolland, later on, he writes, Jaurès is a model, almost unique in modern times, of a great political orator who is at the same time a great thinker, uniting enormous culture with penetrating observation, moral elevation with energy for action. He could raise the masses and enchant the elite at the same time. So he really is a very popular figure. By the way, he was against war. At the time of the First World War, just at the beginning of the war, he was sitting in a cafe and he was assassinated because of his anti-war stance. He opposed the doctrinaire Marxists, as I say, he wanted gradual reform, but he supports colonial policy. We talked about that scramble for Africa. Well, the French socialists say, yeah, it's a good idea. The French need to have those colonies. We just want to have more enlightened governance, but we should have colonies. And I mentioned, I should have mentioned Ferry. Ferry is the minister who is the architect of this colonial policy, although there are a lot of groups involved. And remember, this colonial policy is not different from that of Great Britain or Germany or Portugal or Spain. Somehow in the late 19th century, they are all looking to control colonies. Well, Jaurès, as I say, was assassinated in 1914. And here you have the experience of World War I. L'union sacrée means a sacred union. What it means is all parties support the war effort, no matter where you stood before. And it's probable that Jaurès would have been outvoted. It was seen as a scandal in Germany when all the not scandal, but a scandal from the outside. The Social Democrats all voted to support the war. Same thing happened in France. Before I go to what I call here the miracle in the Marne, let me just say something that I thought about just yesterday. Thomas Mann, the famous famous German novelist. For those with a lot of patience, you may have read The Magic Mountain or some of his other books. Like all German books, they're very long. Thomas Mann in 1914 published, when I first saw the title, a pamphlet called Culture and Civilization. Of course, when I went to read it, it's 400 pages long. And what's interesting, he says that Germany represented culture and France civilization. That is to say, culture in something authentically German, whereas those French were cosmopolitan, looking for something broader. And in a sense, it's true. That's what the French intellectuals felt they were standing for, civilization. Remember, we talked about in the colonies, they talk about this civilizing mission. Civilization is brought to them. I didn't have this on the slide. It may occur later, but I just remember all of a sudden, having read that Thomas Mann, it's one of his books that I doubt has been translated into English. In 1914, the German armies really moved rapidly into France. And it looked bad. It looked like Paris was going to fall. You have what's called the miracle in the Marne River. The French regroup and put up a strong battle at the Marne River. Let's see. I guess on the next slide, we're going to see a picture of that. But they hold the line, and then you have what is this trench warfare, which is, I assume you're somewhat familiar with what happened in the First World War. For 4 years, they lived in these trenches, and they didn't move very far. You got to slaughter the common soldier. And here is a picture of soldiers in World War I, quote, going over the top. Well, these are generals who have no regard of all the countries. They have no regard for the lives of the common soldier. Because when you do that and you rush against a machine gun, you get mowed down. Horrible deaths at the time. Some of you may be familiar with the American Civil War and this infamous Pickett's Charge in the Battle of Gettysburg, where this army marches across ground and they're just shot down because they're marching in formation. Well, here it is, the First World War. They haven't learned anything. That's what they're doing. You get out of the trenches, over the top, you know, the whistle is blown, they go up and they get mowed down. Just incredible slaughter. And then you get in France, you know, this is not a history of World War I. I just want to point out a few things that happened. So here's this miracle in the Marne where the French hold on, but for the next several years, you have slaughter of the common soldier. In 1916, the Germans decide they are going to put such an attack on the fortress at a place called Verdun that the French army will be just decimated. And it's here where someone named Marshal Pétain becomes famous. And we'll see him again. You'll see why if you're not familiar with the name. But in 1916, Verdun. And here he is, the Marshal Pétain. It says here, the chief of the French state. And he says in the beginning, it's called Words of the Marshal. He says, I am here and will remain with you during these dark days. It is a matter of France, its soil, its sons, and he becomes a great inspiration for the French at Verdun. Here's a picture of Verdun 2005. That is the landscape that was caused by the incredible amount of artillery. Look at that way the land is dug out. It's still there. You know, this is almost a century later. Permanent damage to what happened and an indication of how terrible things were. This is just to show you. Here's Verdun. Here's, I'm going to lost myself in where Paris is. But here is Verdun in sort of toward central France, where you have this battle in 1916. And you have the Battle of the Somme at the same time, two major battles where people are being slaughtered. So what I'm trying to point out here is this slaughter of the common soldier. There's this book by Barbara Tuchman on the First World War called The Guns of August. And one of the things you can take away from that book is how mindless all the generals were of what was happening to their armies. And she makes very few exceptions for French, for British, for Russian, for German. It was a real slaughterhouse. It was terrible. Here's an image of 1914 that when it was a miracle in the Marne, there's this famous notion of the French mobilizing all their taxi cabs to take people to the Marne to fight. Everybody was going. And that's part of this so-called miracle in the Marne. And then the Battle of the Somme, which we just saw on the map, was a metaphor for futile and indiscriminate slaughter. Here's a battle, 3 million people fighting. And 1 million of them on both sides are killed or wounded. And what's the result? They move forward, the French forces move forward about 6 miles. Here's a symbol of trench warfare. Not a symbol, a picture of these happen to be German soldiers, but in fact, I don't even know how we know from the sources what nationality they were, but that's what these trenches are like. And by 1917, there's tremendous war weariness. So the war starts in August of 1914. So that's half of 14. 1915, 1916, 1917, and they're moving back and forth just a few miles or sometimes just a few hundred yards back and forth, shot down by machine guns, hit by poison gas, which is introduced by the Germans in the middle of the war. And there is something that the French General Staff tried to hush up. mutinies all over the French army. They did not succeed. And in fact, here you have execution of a soldier, presumably for participating, tied to the post. And there were a number of executions. And here's where I throw in what I just talked to you about, Thomas Mann, culture and civilization. Well, what about the colonies? The French have these colonies. Well, they say, here's a source of manpower. There's an image of the French recruiters looking for soldiers. And you have the so-called Senegalese sharpshooters that some 180,000 of these soldiers are recruited to go to Europe. You know, this on the German side, you get a lot of racist comment, but because they weren't successful at bringing any of their colonial troops in, but the French do bring them in. Although there are a lot of charges that they were used as cannon fodder, which is probably true. And in fact, this is an image of French colonial soldiers, and it's part of a film, which I realize it's difficult to show, that the whole film is meant to say, oh, they weren't cannon fodder, they were just ordinary soldiers. It's such a defensive film. It's amazing. Well, post-war, the war ends November 1918. As I say, this is not a history of World War I. You're probably aware that Germany surrendered. It was a surprise, a shock to the German soldiers and a relief to the Allied soldiers that they finally get a message in October 1918, we surrender, and November 11th becomes what we had as kids, Armistice Day. That was the official end of the First World War in the West. And you get this Treaty of Versailles, which is only one of the treaties at the end of the First World War, but for the moment it becomes one we're going to focus on. So here's you have the areas that are being debated. Alsace-Lorraine, of course, right there in this corner of France. Well, I mean, it's this whole area here. But the French also say, well, until the Germans comply, we're going to have a military occupation of the Rhineland, this whole part of Western Germany. And we're going to get the coal from the Ruhr Valley and the Saar Basin. And then there were other places where there were referenda on who should be the government. But the point here is that the French really thought that they could control Germany for a long time. And if you recall, in 1871, the Germans had imposed a huge reparations bill on the French, which they paid in about 3 years. Well, Versailles was different. The French and the British pushed through a notion that the Germans are responsible for the whole World War and they should pay for everything. So you get this tremendous reparations bill, which is impossible for the Germans to pay. And we're not doing a history of the First World War, we're not doing a history of Germany, but there was an enormous inflation in Germany in 1923, which is often seen as one of the, first of all, possibly caused or fed by this bill for reparations. And it's often seen as one of the issues leading to the rise of Nazis. But in the Treaty of Versailles, Alsace-Lorraine comes back. And here you have this image, Metz city there. Metz and Lorraine return to France. Here is the Lorraine hugging the French soldier. These are Marshal, I'm not sure whether that's Pétain, I think it is up there, as the great hero. We'll hear more about Pétain during the Second World War. very important. But as I mentioned, French reparations, German reparations to France and others, French control of the Rhineland. There is no discussion of North Africa or Indochina. Ho Chi Minh appears at the conference in Versailles, but he doesn't get any kind of hearing